Alright guys, so in this video we're going to talk about these angles that are called vertical angles, and they're going to be very, very important for what's going to come later on with the geometry section for pre-algebra. Alright, this is probably the most important thing that we're going to look at for the entire geometry section. One of the most important things, okay, and it's called vertical angles. Alright, so let's ask ourselves this question real quick. Where do vertical angles come from? And not only that, let's not only answer that question. Okay, so where do vertical angles come from, but what are vertical angles in general? What are vertical angles? Okay, so what we can say, so maybe we'll start off with a little sentence real quick, and then I'll get into some a little geometry explanation after that. All right, so what we can do here is this. So we'll say vertical angles come from two straight lines intersecting. Vertical angles come from two straight lines intersecting. That should be enough for now. All right, so vertical angles come from two straight lines intersecting. All right, so let's see what I mean by that. Okay, so let's draw these two straight lines that are intersecting. So let's say we have this straight line. All right. Okay, so this is one of the straight lines, but it says vertical angles come from two straight lines intersecting. Okay, so what does intersecting mean? It means they cross, right? So crossing, two straight lines crossing each other. Crossing each other. All right, so what we need to do is we need to draw another straight line that crosses this one, and I'm going to draw it like this. All right, so what do we have so far? Okay, so far we have two straight lines. These lines are going on, just say they go on forever in the direction. All right, so we have two straight lines that are intersecting each other. Okay, so what do I mean by vertical angles? Well, vertical angles are the angles that come from the two straight lines intersecting that are vertical to one another. All right, so real quick, let's label these angles. 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right. So what we would say here, the angles that are vertical here, it's literally vertical. It's what it means. Okay. So this is like a vertical line right here. Okay. So this is a vertical line. So 2 and 4 are vertical angles. Okay. Because it's just a vertical line. Okay. It's like, okay, just a vertical line. These are vertical angles. Here's an angle, and here's another angle directly underneath it. And this is like a vertical protractor, vertical ruler. So we say this angle and this angle are vertical angles. Same thing with 1 and 3. Okay, 1 and 3, if you like turned your head sideways, this would be 1 and 3 would be vertical. This angle is vertical to this angle. Okay, so what's also important from the fact that we have these vertical angles is this sentence, okay? It's vertical angles are congruent. Okay, I'm gonna put exclamation points next to this because it's so important. Vertical angles are congruent. Okay, so before I get into that, let's just write some statements real quick. So we'll say this. We'll say angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. okay? Angle 2 and angle 4 are vertical angles. All right. Now, what's special about 1 and 3? Okay, yeah, they're vertical angles, but not only are they just vertical angles, but we also know that vertical angles are congruent. So since 1 and 3 are vertical angles, we know this. Okay, let me draw a little arrow here. We know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Okay, that means this angle and this angle are the same measure. They're the same congruent. They're the same angle. Okay, they're congruent. They're the same shape. All right. So how did we denote that in the triangles video when we were talking about triangles having the same measure? Well, we drew a little arc. Okay, so that's what we're going to draw here, an arc. All right, so 1 and 3 are congruent, okay, because now we have that 1 and 3 are congruent. From two straight lines intersecting, we have two pairs of vertical angles. We have the pair 1 and 3 are vertical angles, and now we're going to have 2 and 4. So let's look at this next one. It says angle 2 and angle 4 are vertical angles. Okay, so 2 and 4 are vertical angles, but now we know that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. How do we know that? Because vertical angles are congruent. We don't prove, and this, by the way, guys, this is assumed. Okay, we assume vertical angles are congruent. Just because the guys who, the people who did all the geometry, okay, back in the day, they just assumed vertical angles are congruent. This is actually called a conjecture in math, okay, a conjecture. And it's something that's assumed to be true. So it's something that is assumed to be true. Okay, so really what we could call this entire video is the vertical angles conjecture. All right, so this is just taken to be true, which is nice because it's very useful to solve problems with. Okay, this is how we're going to be solving a lot of problems for the geometry stuff. Okay, so now we know angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. Well, how can we label this triangle? Not this triangle. How can we label this diagram here so that we know that? Okay, so think back to the triangles video. When you want to talk about two angles being congruent, you give them little arcs, right? But notice something special about this triangle. Okay, I'm sorry, I keep saying triangle. About these straight lines. Okay, notice something, that angle 2 and angle 4, those are not the same thing as angle 1 and angle 3, right? Look how much larger angle 2 is. Look how much larger angle 4 is. Angle 1 and 3 are acute. All right, so what we're going to need to do is we're going to need give this guy a different name, and we're going to give him a double arc, okay, like we did with triangles video. All right, so he gets a double arc, and the angle 4 gets a double arc because they're congruent. All right, so these two and 4 are congruent, and 1 and 3 are congruent. All right, and that's pretty much it for vertical angles and what we're going to need them for. Okay. Another thing we can talk about for vertical angles, maybe we'll talk about in some future videos, but let's go through a little recap real quick. So we started off with vertical angles. We asked ourselves the question, where do vertical angles come from? Okay, what are vertical angles? Well, vertical angles come from two straight lines intersecting each other. Okay, they just come from two straight lines crossing each other. In this case, we have this straight line crossing this straight line. All right, and then what did we say the vertical angles were? Well, the vertical angles are literally the angles that are vertical to one another. Okay, so 2 is vertical to 4. Okay, angle 2 is vertical to angle 4. And if you turn your head and you look at this one, okay, you can see angle 1 is vertical to angle 3. All right, these two are angle 1 and 3 are vertical to each other. Okay, so and then once we talked about these being vertical to each other, we said the most important statement in the entire video, which is vertical angles are congruent. All right, that's very important. And then since we had vertical angles being congruent, we said angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. And what that implies is that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 because vertical angles are congruent. So since 1 and 3 are vertical angles, we said angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Then we said the same thing about angle 2 and angle 4. Okay, angle 2 and angle 4 are vertical angles. All right, and since they're vertical angles are congruent. So that meant angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. All right, and then we just talked about all this being a conjecture. All right, that just comes from the Greeks way back in the day. All right, and it's pretty much this guy. His name is Euclid. All right, very special guy in geometry. Feel free to look him up one day. All right, that's gonna cut it off for this video. Euclid, Euclid. All right, guys, see you in the next video. Thanks.